Good afternoon, folks. East Coast time. Good morning, folks. West Coast time. And good evening or almost good nightish time, folks. India time, who may be watching, and of course, across the world, whosoever would be joining. Thank you and welcome to the Saturday noon hour, brought to you by the US India Political Action Committee and the Imagine India Institute. My name is Robinder Sachdev. Every Saturday noon hour Eastern Time, US, we hold a conversation with a distinguished panel on issues especially of interest to the Indian American community, domestic American policy, and of course, when it comes to Indian American community and domestic American policy, it also has a linkage and a deep interest for everyone on US Indian relations. Today, we are absolutely happy to have an amazing and a distinguished panel to hold a discussion on the issue of trade and economy. It's money makes the world go, perhaps, but money needs a lot of enabling environment before the world it makes the world go. The topic of the day today that we have is we are looking at a compare contrast between what the Biden administration's trade and economic policies are and unfolding and what were the Trump administration policies. Of course, our focus is more on Biden administration policy, but as a tool to understand more, we are using a compare and contrast exercise. We are amazing panel with us today. And folks, this is Facebook Live going right now on the US India Political Action Committee Facebook page, on Imagine India Facebook page. Please do pop in your questions. Any question would be welcome, and I'm sure that our distinguished panel would factor in your question and your thoughts in the replies or their views that they share with us. So remember, this is live right now, so we welcome anyone. Please come by, wave by, check by, put in a like. You cannot dislike, Zuckerberg doesn't allow, but come put your questions. Now, that said, let me introduce our distinguished panel that we have with us today. We have Dr. Surjit S. Bhalla, Executive Director for India at the International Monetary Fund, an eminent author and columnist, and an icon in his own right, an eclectic engineering, economics, the World Bank, India, government. So an amazing mind that we have. I think it's a pleasure and honor for us to have you with us, sir. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Bhalla. Thank you. We have with us also another brilliant ignited mind, Dr. Praveen Krishna, who's the Chung Ju Young Distinguished Professor of International Economics and Business at SAIS, the School of SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. Uh, Again, a very eclectic and brilliant mind on trade and economic policy, and who's been doing a lot of work actually on areas of trading blocks, etc. So we would have some questions along those lines also, and regional arrangements. But we'll be running across the spectrum. Thank you so much for joining us, this distinguished panel. Once again, may I request our viewers, anyone who's watching wherever in the US, in India, or wherever, please do come in with your questions. We'll be definitely more than happy to take your questions with us. That being said, may I invite now Dr. Surjit Bhalla to make his opening comments on the day. And sir, you can take it any which way. The overarching topic of the day is that it's a compare contrast between what Trump administration was heading in terms of its economic and trade policies. And now, of course, there's a new game in town where that game is heading. So between the two, where are we now, or what is your analysis of this scenario as in the day today? And by the way, today in the morning there was the American Rescue Plan, which President Biden just unveiled. So that all being said, the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this. Let me start off with the following comment that I think this decade is going to be much about US and China in terms of how they resolve their differences and what happens on the trade front, etc. It's also going to be, I think, tangentially, though not exactly with this topic, India's decade, but maybe we can come to that later. Now, what do I see as the differences between the policies that may come about with Biden and the policies that we had before? I think one big difference we can expect is in style. And I think I am of the belief that we'll virtually have zero difference in the substance of their policies vis-a-vis trade, vis-a-vis China, and vis-a-vis economic policies domestically. So, it's more the same. I think the big elephant in the room, there are two big elephants in the room, US and China, and how they resolve their differences is going to be something that will preoccupy us for a long, long time. But as far as the next near future is concerned, and I don't see much on the horizon that will change the policies that the US has towards China or towards trade for that matter. And there's a long history of US policies on trade. We know what they are. To conclude, style, there'll definitely be a difference. Substance, not much.
Wonderful, sir. You've given an amazing, I think, roundup, and that's what, I think expertise and wisdom comes down to. As you said, that this decade would be US and China. And the point you're saying, the difference in style would be different, but the substance would remain the same. But also, you raised a question that, if I may take a follow-up quick question with you, and if you can give a quick, perspective on that. You also said that it will depend upon how they resolve their differences. So my question would be here, if you can quickly, kind of throw a light on this. If it were a Trump administration, how would it have resolved the differences versus right now how the Biden administration will resolve the differences? Because that itself sets off something like a fork in the road, or maybe
Yeah.
a path. Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
So I think, look, alignments will have to change or are changing in the world. I think China has staked out from the various speeches coming out there a certain approach to world affairs. There's in between other countries. So I think how they resolve the differences, to a certain extent, if by differences you resolve that they agree, I think it's a low probability event. But I think this is when happens when power shifts take place in the world throughout history. The differences never get resolved, and you learn to accommodate each other. You learn to live with each other, and that's where style comes in. So I do not underemphasize style, but I think of great concern to everybody is the substance. And on that, I see very little difference.
Thank you
From the
so much.
US side, I'm not speaking from the Chinese side, I'm speaking from the US side. I see very little difference in the two administrations.
Thank you so much, sir. Completely. I mean, I think that's a brilliant point you're making. And once again, folks, whosoever is tuning in, listening, I can see some people are watching. We have quite a few people watching, but kind of lurking. Guys, come on, put in your questions and comments. We would love to get you engaged in this discussion. Your questions will make this more lively. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhala. Now, may I invite Dr. Krishna for your opening comments, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting my participation on this panel. Great pleasure to be here. And a first time for me to be on the panel with Dr. Surjit Bhalla as well. So I'm thrilled to do that. Overall, let me say that I agree almost 100% with what Dr. Bhalla has just said. For me, the Trump years, if you just kind of summarize everything that Donald Trump did in terms of trade policy, it would probably be best described by the terms aggressive unilateralism, right? So there was a kind of as Dr. Bhalla said, there was a particular substance, a certain desire to achieve certain types of economic policy goals, and then the style was a uniquely Trump style, which was bombastic, aggressive, unpredictable, highly variable, even unknown to people in Washington and people closest to him as to which side of the bed the president is going to wake up the next morning and what turn the story is going to take. To these two things, I'll just add one, and this is maybe more just an element of it's a semantic difference. But in addition to style and substance, I would add process, right? So the one thing that the Trump administration did in pursuit of its goals, in pursuit of its economic policy goals, in addition to the president's kind of personal style, is their approach with respect to the WTO and WTO rules, right? So the US is bound by WTO rules, as is China, as is India. And in pursuing its trade policy approach, what the Trump administration did was to deviate quite significantly from some of the key rules of the WTO by exploiting certain, what you might call a loophole, national security exemptions, etc., use them very aggressively, very powerfully. I think they've set a bad precedent for the future. But that's a kind of a process matter, and I think they took a step in the wrong direction there. Secondly, with respect to the WTO, also having to do with process, it's kind of a well-appreciated point in trade circles, but maybe not as well known publicly, is that the WTO court system has now been completely paralyzed because the judges that need to be appointed to the WTO system, there's no judges left, and they needed to be reappointed, and the Obama administration already had been dragging its feet on this because of some issues that the US had with the WTO. And the number of judges just kept getting lower and lower. And finally, by December of 2019, had almost completely emptied out. And in fact, you don't have any judges left to bench cases at the WTO. Everything is has been held up. And so that was another process-related issue with respect to the WTO. Now, as far as substance, I agree with Dr. Bhalla 100%, which is that I believe that the fundamental attitude towards both international trade as well as China remains more or less constant. There may be some variations in shade here and there in Washington. Different people may have different views, but the core stays the same. As far as style, I expect there will be a different style. Certainly, Donald Trump is a very different man from Joe Biden, so certainly we can expect stylistic differences. But also as far as process, I believe this administration, I expect this administration will be a little more cautious about deviating away from the WTO framework, maybe a little bit more keen to use multilateral architectures to kind of, bring China in, so to speak. But other than that, I think they're about the same. And the last point I'd make there is that if you look at the nature of the appointments of the Biden administration in terms of their economic policy team, all of the appointments, all of them on the Council of Economic Advisors, slightly unusually, which is the main kind of advisory body to the president, they're all labor economists and sort of center left, I would say, signaling to the world that the Biden administration's interest and intent is to kind of secure jobs. They have a kind of the domestic economy in mind, jobs in the domestic economy in mind, and concerns about trading with developing countries that might harm domestic jobs. The same thing is already true, I think, with the USTR recently appointed, who's also been speaking in similar ways, talking about jobs and domestic issues, and that being the kind of the guiding framework for trade policy. So these are going to dominate. In a sense, maybe there may be some differences of degree, but I fully agree with Dr. Bhalla. The substance, for most part, stays the same.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krishna, for your thoughts. I'll have a couple of comments on that, and I'll come to Dr. Bhalla next. But in the meanwhile, my job as a moderator is to kind of urge folks, whosoever is watching, you may be enjoying the conversation. You see, what happens very often, people look at this as a video, as a recorded video. The point is, folks, whosoever is watching, this is a live video right now. This is going live stream on the US India Political Action Committee Facebook page. This is going live stream on the Imagine India Institute Facebook page. So you are welcome to put in your questions, comments, and we'll be more than happy to take it up. So come on, participate, engage, take advantage of participating in this digital world with a beautiful conversation that we're having with some brilliant minds with us. Thank you. Now, Dr. Bhalla, before I come to you, I would like to just kind of, link into what Dr. Krishna was saying. Absolutely, it's the process. The process is different, right? I remember that folks were saying that if you want to understand how Trump works, you got to spend a couple of years in New York's real estate industry, because that's how Trump's, mechanism of, negotiation and deals happened, the art of the deal. And also he grew up in that, or not grew up, he kind of, fine-tuned this. So to understand Trump, you got to look at how negotiations and hardball negotiations happen in the New York real estate business, to understand the process to which Dr. Krishna is mentioning, which also, of course, then, relates to the style of out there. Now, Dr. Bhalla, we'll come to the domestic affair. We got several rounds, and we'll, pick your minds on that. But also another question coming to my mind with what Dr. Krishna was saying, that as he was mentioning the USTR and various appointments. So I have two questions with you. First, who do you think would be the Peter Navarro of the Biden administration, or is there a Peter Navarro? Right? I mean, if a big picture in that sense, right? And then right now we are still wanting to discuss the domestic American economy or the approach to American domestic economy with respect to Biden, and of course the American rescue plan of today. So one speculative question, fun question: do you see any quote unquote Peter Navarro kind of a influence, ideologue, advisor within the Biden administration, perhaps, or if not within, but a think tank outside who influences or influences in that sense. And then secondly, within the American domestic context, and we'll come to international, but of course everything will get rolled into China also, right? But within the domestic American economy sense, how do you see Biden being able to I would not say jumpstart, but whatever Biden is promising within the American economy in the next 6 months to 1 year, sir.
Let me start with the second part first on Biden. Look, history produces oftentimes the appropriate people for that time period, and I think Biden, by not only changing in terms of style versus the previous president, but I think, there is a healing process that is necessary in the US. It's a very divided society. And actually, it's not just the US that's a divided society. Many societies around the world are polarized. And I think that's a consequence of globalization. So, for example, one of the themes of the division is the lack of jobs or lack of wage growth for a large section of the American population. This has been a trend since 1980. Over the last 3, 4 years is only the first time that real wages or the median real wage for those who are not college graduates went up. Otherwise, it stayed constant for about 30, 40 years. And the reason, many reasons there could be, but the dominant reason is what we call globalization. Basically, the world is one market, the world is one place, and firms can choose workers in different countries to work not only, so immigration is not that big a story anymore. It is the fact that where are the jobs going? And so therefore, in the Trump administration was the first time that this became center stage, recognition of this problem. It's not that people had not, or politicians had not recognized before, but he was the first one to really articulate it. And possibly because his voting base was the people who were, for lack of a better word, in one, the ones whose wages hadn't really gone up that much. So I think that story of globalization affecting a large segment of the American population, and I think it's more globalization rather than immigration, which got a lot of attention. But I don't think that's the story, because the real wages, as I mentioned, for high school graduates has really not gone up for a long, long time. So I think Biden needs to come up with economic policies, basically enlarge on the quote unquote, the big, Lyndon Johnson's society, etc., and see how far the healing process can continue. And I think, given his experience in the Senate for a long, long time, he has built bridges across the divide with the Republicans for two generations almost. So I think he's best placed to really improve on the healing process, which will be very, very important. So I think that's the first. Second is the economic situation, and there I think the U.S. economy, along with the world's economy, has suffered a lot in the previous virus year, COVID year, and how that situation gets resolved around the world is going to affect what domestic policies are pursued. My own guess is that I think the world will recover faster than most people believe, but the fact remains, for the reasons I just articulated on the globalization, that I think the shift away from developed economies to developing economies is a long term, slow shift. And I don't think um, that the US and or Western Europe will be able to proceed much faster than what they have. Indeed, I would think if they proceeded any faster than what happened between 2014, 15, and 19, it'll be a major story. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that's how the world is changing and what leaders have to account for in terms of their policies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bala. We have a question or a comment from a viewer. Awesome. We'll take that up. Yeah, sure. Mona Manihar, she, I would assume, perhaps. Pardon me. Uh, okay. The question from the audience is that the new focus would be on making WTO alive again, as it should be for the US growth and economy and a better world economy. Thank you so much, Mona. I'm sure our speakers, as they go on to the next rounds, would take in your comment. Once again, can our producer please put up the comment that she had put in? She's saying that the focus would be on WTO. Yes, definitely. In fact, I think that's what Dr. Balla is also referring to right now. Globalization, how we look at it, and what Dr. Our colleague was also mentioning right now before us, Dr. Krishna. Before we move on to Dr. Krishna, may I have a quick follow-up question with you, Dr. Balla? Listening to you, I see two big takeaways. One is that you're saying healing of the society within America, or let's say healing globally, widely as such. Absolutely, sir. Now, secondly, you were talking about globalization, but you also talked about wages. And right now in America, there's a discussion. In fact, the bill, I think the American Rescue Plan today is talking about a minimum wage of $15 an hour at 2025 as the target versus $7.50 right now. So my quick two questions to you would be that how how much of progress do you see on the quote unquote healing of America in just one red, blue, green kind of a thing? And on the second question of wages, do you see the wages as per the American Rescue Plan reaching up to 20 by the year 2025 at $15 an hour, sir?
Okay. I think, look, my view, and I'd be very interested in knowing what Krishna has to say on this, that to try and attack an income distribution problem through raising the wage, and precisely in the present the transactions cost for firms are close to zero. So therefore, it is very easy for a producer, for a firm to hire somebody in Vietnam, to hire somebody in India, to hire somebody in China, wherever. So to think that by raising the wage, you will raise the average income levels, because we'll have to worry then about what happens to unemployment. I think the world needs to come to, and especially the developed countries. And as you know, in India, we've been very successful at income transfers, direct benefit transfers, etc. I think that's the approach that the US should also take from an economic point of view. You've got an income distribution problem. Absolutely. Do it through the tax and transfer method rather than, and I don't think you can tax it much more, but we leave that for another occasion, but do it through income transfers. Do not do it through wages. And therefore, I think the wage bill, raising the minimum wage, will pass. It will not pass. I do not think it will pass. There are better ways to solve the problem that they are trying to address.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balla. Absolutely. Meanwhile, we had a couple of comments from some other audiences. Travis is saying Biden is in office, Trump is gone. Sure, sir. Yeah, or pardon, we do not know the this thing. Yeah, Trump is gone, but we are using that as a case study of compare and contrast in order for us. I mean, in social sciences or in several fields of study, we know compare and contrast is a method of kind of drawing out more views. So that's why we're using this contrast of you know uh, differences between Trump and Biden. Of course, the focus is on Biden. Biden's in office. That's what matters now. Thank you so much, Travis. Now, may I move to Praveen? Sir, Dr. Krishna, same with you. Would you like to, take forward what Dr. Bhalla was saying, and he was interested in your views, so please.
Yeah, thank you. So, a couple of things. Just coming back quickly to the question that you had raised earlier about particular appointments in the Biden administration, who's the Peter Navarro and so forth. I think actually, even on that kind of issue, I don't believe that Biden, as a matter of his own personal style, would want to have around him or have somebody like a Rasputin-like figure next to him whispering evil thoughts about China or something like that, which is the way that most people imagine Peter Navarro's role in Washington. But from the other appointments that he's made, it's become very clear, and I think a couple of these are in the Council of Economic Advisors. One of these is in the USTR, that the main point that Dr. Bhalla just made, which is that there is a fundamental issue in this country, as in many other countries, about the distribution of income. There is a concern that the top end of the income distribution has just started to dominate in terms of the fraction of income that is earned by the people at the top, the fraction of wealth that is held by people at the top. And this question of, you combine that with globalization in the background, technological change in the background, job losses for people at the bottom end of the income distribution due to deindustrialization and so forth. This is a big question. It's been with us for a while. I believe that under Biden, it's a Democratic government. The individuals that have been appointed are, kind of progressive liberals into kind of these economic advisory positions. I think that definitely will be the focus of the administration in terms of how they see the issues. I think I agree for most part with what Dr. Bhalla said as well on the minimum wage issue, right? The idea that you raise the minimum wage and that it will be without consequences for employment, that firms will continue to want to hire as many people as they did, that seems to me a little bit fanciful. Now, it is true that there are a couple of research papers in the last couple of decades that have, even larger scale in studies in New Jersey and a couple of other places that have found that when you increase wages or raise the minimum wage, that in fact, employment has not declined, right? So that's in the background. Any economist that you talk to and you say, well, what don't you think raising the minimum wage would be a problem? They're going to throw these studies at you and say, no, these studies show us that this is not the case. I'm a little skeptical of that at a kind of a national level. That said, it is very clear that this level of divergence in terms of the kind of what's going on with the income distribution is not sustainable for any society, and nor should it be. The U.S. is a very rich country. It should find ways of balancing things out better. It should do so in a way that is economically smart, intelligent. Don't create the wrong incentives from hiring standpoint. Don't create the wrong incentives for people to quit working and so on and so forth. So I hope that what the administration is thinking about, and they've hired some very good people here, is of kind of intelligent, clever ways, maybe even innovative ways in which they can address this problem without dramatically altering the incentives in a negative way for anybody involved. You don't want the very wealthy people of this country saying, let's leave the United States and go park ourselves in the Bahamas or something like that, or just stop innovating or stop doing what we were doing because we're going to be taxed. You don't want people at the bottom end of the income distribution reacting differently. You don't want firms saying, why should we hire workers? Let's go, outside the country and hire somebody else. These are all problems. And these are all, if you use blunt instruments like a minimum wage, you have to worry about the fact that there will be consequences. And I think the time is right, really, and there's lots of good ideas, lots of good experiences in other countries for the US to start thinking carefully about what instrumentalities and methods it might use to address some of these issues. And I hope that they come up with something reasonable. It's always impossible. It's impossible, really, to come up with perfect solutions to these kinds of problems. There's always going to be one sort of slippage or the other. But let's hope that they come up with something reasonably smart.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krishna. As you were talking and as Dr. Balla was talking, we had a comment coming from one of our viewers. Please, guys, keep your questions and comments coming. We had from Kanan Srinivasan. He himself is a local participant in democracy in Virginia. I remember for the treasurer of the state of Virginia. He's saying many states and localities already have higher minimum wages compared to federal minimum wage. Yeah, great point that, within the US, the federal wage versus the states, the US system is the federal system has its own take and the states have their own take. Thank you so much, Kanan, for your for your comment and thought. Absolutely welcome. Before I come to Dr. Bhalla, uh, Dr. Krishna, what you said were some very interesting things. Apart from this whole issue of labor arbitrage and all, and that's the question, sir, Dr. Bhalla, which I'll come to you, sir, if I may frame it, moving from there. You mentioned that American, and we are talking American domestic economy so far, and then next round we are going to move into international, and then of course India, US, India, the impact of US economic and trade policies on India. But a quick question I'll ask, or I'll put it that way. You mentioned that American corporations not being in Caymans or any other islands and all, and American wealth being generated, or corporate wealth staying in America means paying taxes in America, basically, right? Versus that. But that also brings, so that's one question there. Now, this is for Dr. Balla, sir. One, right? So, how do you see that American corporations, for their own tax purposes and for their own the firm objectives moving with respect to that, but also it brings, just like in the previous round, you mentioned also about healing of America. You see, we are talking quantitative and qualitative, right? In the previous your comments, you mentioned qualitative healing of America, and you mentioned wages, right? Similarly, in this round, I would ask you a question on the quantitative side, that firms moving out of America, how much of impact all this arbitrage would it have on American domestic economy? But on the qualitative side, I would also ask you the big picture question, which is riling a lot of us right now, that which also Dr. Krishna mentioned, that wealth is getting concentrated, inequities are growing, large corporations are getting larger and larger and larger, and therefore that also has an impact not only in America, globally. We're seeing it right now, especially like, let's say, the tech players or whichever for the time being. So, what are your thoughts on that, sir?
Okay. Let me first address the issue of income inequality, which Dr. Krishna also joined in on, and on transfers. It turns out that once you take into account the pre-tax and transfer distribution of income in the US is very unequal and has become more unequal over the last 10, 20, 30 years. But the post-tax and transfer distribution is really hasn't changed that much. The share of the top 1% has gone up by 3 percentage points rather than 13 percentage points, which has been alluded to by studies. So it's a tricky business as to how do you measure transfers from the data. It's not tricky in terms of conceptually, but how do you glean it from the macro data that you have as to who gets what transfers. So that's the first point. Second, on terms of firms and taxation, this is really an ongoing process. I don't know when it really started, but I think over the last 10 years, that governments around the world are getting together in terms of bringing about policies that will prevent the kind of tax haven advantages firms across the world have used. So I think tax havens 10 years from now will be not extinct. These things never go extinct. You can have bitcoins or whatever, I don't know. The financial world is complicated enough. But I do think that the governments are really coordinating in terms of putting some restrictions or some hurdles on the way of escaping taxes by firms. So I'm quite optimistic on that. That is not to do with so much Biden versus Trump, but I think internationally, with Europeans, Americans, Indians, I think they are getting together to solve that issue. So I don't think this tax haven issue will be as dominant over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you so much. I'll have a follow-up question to this. And the next round for Pratap will be getting into US, India, or the impact on India, because that's a lot of concern for a lot of folks of Indian origin, Indian American community within the US and in India. And folks, meanwhile, please keep your questions coming. As you know, our guests are referring and contextualizing your questions. But before I move to Dr. Krishna, Dr. Bala, I have a follow-up question with you on that, please. And Dr. Krishna, that would also be a question for you, please. I mean, just for a minute. Dr. Bala, my question then is looking at, let's say, okay, fine, maybe you're looking at, theoretical context and all, but let's say supply chains in China, let's come down to that, right? US economy, or be it Trump or Biden, if style different, but maybe the objective the same, or maybe some different things. Uh, there has been a lot of talk about supply chains from China, or the US companies moving their supply chains out of China. Now, in a very simplistic sense, can you share with our viewers, can you share with us all, how far do you think some changes have happened? How many such supply chains have shifted? And you take a long view, you're an economist, sir. You take a contextual view of quantitative, qualitative, etc. What do you see happening in the next 5 years? 10 is long, but let's say in the next 5 years. How much of supply chain from American corporations, for a variety of reasons, tax incentives also, by the way, America's wanting to bring them back into America, right? Rather than going to Vietnam or Indonesia or India or Brazil. How much of do you see happening? Because that in our subsequent round would relate to the impact of American policies on India. Sir.
Now, the supply chain issue is a function of two important factors. First, in terms of the political geopolitics vis-a-vis US and China, but more importantly, it is that China is now quite a mature economy, and there is the middle income trap that is often talked about, but really there is no trap. What happens when you become middle income, and especially with the speed by which China has become, that you your future rate of growth goes down. You're closer to the frontier than you were before, and therefore, how much you can catch up, the speed with which you can catch up with the rest of the world goes down. Translated, your rate of growth, your trend rate of growth will go down. And which is exactly what is happening in China, from something like 11, 12% just 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. It's now down to about 5.5%. And that trend is going to continue. There's the demographics and aging and labor supply problem in addition vis-a-vis China. So I think it's a natural consequence of what is happening, independent of the politics, that supply chains will have to shift outside of China. That is and other countries who have benefited from the supply chains, they then move up. So it's a trickle down, if you will, policy trickle down effects taking place on a global scale rather than taking place on individual. So a host of factors are converging for the supply chains to shift. Now, I think the greatest shift will be outside of China, but then Vietnam is there. They will, some of it will shift. India has really opened up over the last couple of years, and especially the last year, in terms of its policies, such that making it much more attractive for foreign investment to come to India And that's part so that the supply chain will now include India, whereas previously it didn't. So I think that's and India, of course, as the largest um, beneficiary in terms of the population and the labor and the educated labor. Another factor that has happened in India over the last 10 to 15 years, which hasn't got the attention that it deserves, is the fact that today female education attainment is higher or close to exactly the same as male education attainment. And over the next few years, will get to be higher. So the quality of labor in India has really improved, especially on the female side. So therefore, it's worth noting that in 2018, for the first time in the 1,000-year history of Oxford University, there were more female undergraduates than male. Well, in India, in the same year, there was the same amount of female undergraduates as male. And now we get the data with a lag, but I'm quite confident that the number of female undergraduates is now higher than men. So this is another big story vis-a-vis the attraction of India and supply chains moving to India is the quality of the labor force. There is also we already have a very well-functioning software industry, technological industry, research, pharmaceutical industry. So the factors are falling in place for India to be a major attractor of being a major component of the supply chains. Previously, it was not that much. It didn't happen that much because we ourselves made policies which restricted foreign investment in India, etc. Now we've really opened up. So I think that's the big story as far as both India is concerned and supply chains are concerned.
That's a very uh, because a lot of debate upon the matter of supply chains and disruption of supply chains in America asking, in Japan asking, and Japan actually allocating some $1 or $2 billion incentive for its companies to relocate from China back to Japan or Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. I mean, that's the narrative which is out there. But what you're highlighting is something I think which is pretty well known, but not much in discussion, is the fact that the arbitrage again of wages perhaps that you're saying, right, due to which and productivity, due to which supply chains or corporates would need to are needing to relook their supply. That's an amazingly interesting reminder, I think, and has to be factored in. Thank you so much, sir. Once again, may I request any viewers, guys, folks, you can see we are having a brilliant discussion. You're welcome to put in your questions and comments, and we'll take it from there. We have a comment coming in from Kanan. Thank you, Kanan. See, our distinguished panelists, what happens as we keep on this discussion going, some of our viewers get regular and they enjoy the conversation and they start participating more and more. So we have Kanan saying that excellent point on women's education. Thanks so much for highlighting it for Dr. Bhalla. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhalla. One of our audience is talking about exactly the point. It resonates with them a lot with us. Thank you so much. Now, may I come to Dr. Krishna? It's a ongoing conversation, same aspect, supply chains. But may I then ask you also, you look into like trading blocks also, of course, Dr. Bhala also does, but may I, if might take liberty with you. India stepped away from RCEP. That's one, fair enough. There was talk of the TPP, forget the alphabet soup, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and all, etc. Again, within the context of supply chains, what do you think the impact of Biden administration policies would be on American corporations? And you know what America does? It signals to a lot of other folks, right? And you know, a lot of other realignments take place. So, what would you think in terms of how the Biden administration would be looking at global trade, global supply chains, and what impact would it have on India? What developments may be there, could be there in the next 1 year, 3 year? short term, medium term, and what impact it could have on India, sir?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll say a couple of things about supply chains and the experience we've already had in the last 3 or 4 years, and then maybe talk a bit about the coming years and maybe talk about RCEP as well. So the first thing is that it seems that for supply chains, trade policy actually matters, and meaning supply chains are responding relatively quickly, right? So it's not something you automatically would have said that, when the US changed its trade policy on China, that there would be as big a movement away from China into Vietnam. That was interesting. Maybe you would have predicted some of it, but it was actually quite impressive to see how quickly you had that movement away from China into Vietnam, hundreds of factories relocating, goods coming in. They're primarily Chinese goods, perhaps rebranded a bit in Vietnam, and then sent over with a made in Vietnam stamp to the US to escape the 25% taxes or so that were being put. So that's the first point I'd make, which is that there is significant, as economists would call it, elasticity there. Firms are willing to move. If the tax regime changes, they will move, right? So with that, then the question is, to one of the things you asked earlier, is it the case that tough US policy, trade policy will bring the supply chains back to the US? I don't think so, because I think the differences in terms of wages and competitiveness and the ability of China and Vietnam and others to produce these goods more competitively than the US still remains. And a 10 or 25% tax on China or anybody else is not going to change that picture too much. Maybe particular industries may be incentivized a little better than others to return to the US. But I mostly see if there's a prolongation and extension of this trade war with China, and because of the underlying demographic factors and the wage factors and the kind of evolution of the domestic economy in China, I do agree that there's going to be some opportunities for other countries in Asia to kind of get into those parts of the supply chain that China currently occupies. Now, is it going to be India? Is it going to be Vietnam? What fraction of this is India going to be able to get in competition with other Asian countries? I think the point that was made, which I agree with 100%, is that 10, 15 years ago, we were in no position at all, perhaps, to aggressively participate in or get a foothold in this space. But now, with reforms that have taken place, with the rationalization of our international tax structure, which has also been quite impressive over the years, with various regulatory changes in terms of the labor markets, in terms of foreign direct investment, some good things have happened, right? So we can have a debate about how much more the government needs to do, or should it have done it sooner, and so forth. But if you leave that aside, India is certainly a better place today than it was a few years ago, certainly many years ago. And so India has that opportunity. I don't necessarily think that we've made it quite as easy as, say, a Vietnam has for an exiting Chinese firm to want to come and base itself in India. I don't think we're quite there. We have some room to kind of go and some gap to bridge there. But if we do it, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us for all of the reasons. Chinese population is declining, Chinese wages are rising, U.S. suppliers, U.S. corporates might want to diversify risks and kind of move away from China a little bit. All of these reasons give us ample opportunity and space, and it's going to be, to some extent, we'll see how this works out. I think India's, like I said, in a better position than it was, and so there is that. Now, on the RCEP agreement, which India kind of politely declined to join relatively recently, incidentally, it still has the option of doing so. I think it has another maybe 18 months or something like that. I've lost track of the actual calendar on this. But India, having negotiated with the remaining partners for almost about 10 years now, and apparently come somewhat close in the negotiations. We don't know the details. I don't know the details. There's some small possibility that they may go back to RCEP. I think this is unlikely. So for the RCEP, the way I saw it was, part of it was exactly what you mentioned in the issues that were just discussed, which is that would have enhanced, on the plus side of the ledger, that would have enhanced, I think, our ability to participate in a more frictionless manner, no taxes, etc., impeding the flow of goods between countries, would have allowed us to participate in a more frictionless manner in this kind of broad network of production that spreads from China to Korea to Japan to various other countries in the region. We had that opportunity. And if you look at kind of the typical statistics of Indian participation in supply chains and so forth, they're quite low compared to our Asian neighbors. So there was room there. The flip side of it, of course, is the concessions that we would have made in terms of market access to China. and how much how challenging that would have been for a domestic manufacturing sector. China is, of course, a very, very competitive player, and that would have created a whole set of challenges. Some of it, I think, could have been managed, and I think there was a framework within RCEP that allowed for very slow liberalization. I think the liberalization within RCEP was only expected to be done over maybe a 20-year period, so India would have had plenty of time to fully liberalize, and the various other provisions that would have cushioned the blow a little bit within RCEP in terms of, you can reverse some of the liberalization if it turned out to be very damaging for you. There's various other countermeasures against kind of sudden trade inflows and so forth. So I think it's a challenging economic and political decision. And on top of everything else, because you had the kind of the geopolitical factor and the border clashes and so forth, I think it's made it difficult, unlikely that India would join. But I have to say that even if you had not had what you did have in kind of last summer, the border clashes with the Chinese, it was there's some great opportunities there, and it's not without its challenges. And whether what was negotiated within RCEP by our negotiators was sufficient to kind of allow some room for India to participate or not, I'm actually not sure. And I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krishna. Of course, a very detailed and well-rounded view. Now we move to the last two rounds. Of course, we can keep going. The conversation is so interesting. We have some comment coming in from Kanan again. Kanan, thank you so much. Kanan is saying, would love to get the panel's view on what top things India needs to do to be able to do or be scalable manufacturing, red tape issues, etc., infrastructure. Thanks. Thank you, Karan. I think, that's the context. We'll come to that. And, what are the things that India needs to kind of maybe do to engage more or leverage or synergize more with the US and global economic system for a better economic growth, let's say. Karan, definitely, sir. We'll get back. And folks, please keep on keeping your questions coming. This is Facebook Live right now. This is not a recorded video. Our panel would love. Now, may I come to Dr. Bhala? Okay, sir. So, in a sense, we've discussed, and the audiences and the panel here are fairly or reasonably versed with the context of what all is being discussed about, right? And our intent is to get this conversation out amongst the wider Indian American community, especially amongst the folks who are interested in about US economy, of course, and definitely a soft corner on US India relations, and of course the bigger picture. So, Dr. Bhala, given the context which we've reached so far, what do you think that would be some policies of the Biden administration which are out there, which could kind of, like, let's say the green focus of the Biden administration? Do you see any such, because end of the day, every country works for its own bottom line, right? So whatever the US Biden administration is doing is for its own economic growth and, of course, engaging with international partners. So what are some green shoots that you see in the policies of the Biden administration that would, apart from having whatever the intended effect within America, have a spillover effect globally, and within that global effect, as a natural with India? So, and of course, what India needs to do is a separate part, but there could be some things which America wants to do for its own domestic, which it has to do, and therefore there will be a spillover, and
Okay. Let me see if I understand the question, but I want to respond to what Krishna just said on RCEP, that it's in equal parts. This is not a normal. Most trade agreements have a large content of economics and some content of politics. No trade agreement is devoid of either. But RCEP in particular has a large component of international and Chinese politics. So I think we can't really assess it in the traditional economist terms. And that is how that trade agreement needs to be looked at, and independent of the border clashes that happened last year. I was heading a committee on trade, and at the time that the RCEP came up, and it was the it wasn't a done deal. It happened while our report came out. We broadly supported the expert group supported trade agreements, but I think we everybody recognized that this was large parts political, and I think our assessment has turned out to be right. Now we come to on US and India, and if it was on the green economy, I think what also has not been emphasized enough, that I think India has a surprisingly, uh, for many, great record on green policies. That the German Watch, which is an NGO which looks at the green policies of various countries, ranked India in the top 10. And actually, it's the top six because the positions one to three are not taken up by any country because no country has been that good. But anyway, in terms of our climate change policies, and climate mitigation policies, India is there at the front. And this is going to be, I think, a large part of, and I think the Biden administration is also very much in favor of, and we can see the climate change, all of us, for a much greener world and better policies on that front. So this might be a great moment for collaboration between India and the US, that we have very similar views. And indeed, in terms of performance, India's performance is, as I said, number 9, but maybe number 6 for 2 years in a row. And both US and China are way, way behind in terms of what they have done for climate change. So there is an opportunity here for India to really build up on its leadership on climate change issues, which I do think are going to dominate outside of US China. The other big issue that's going to dominate world politics, world economics, and world discussion is policies towards climate change.
Thank you so much. I would quick question with you, and before moving on to Dr. Krishna, you are an advisor or have been our advisor to governments, decision makers, and all, etc. Okay, before this, next round would be the last round about the Indian American community as to how or what the Indian American community can somehow, engage or if not do more or learn more about US India trade and economy and, play some role or participate or gain from it. So the last round would be about the Indian American community. Before coming to that, uh, Dr. Bhala, what would be your one or two big picture ideas about how US and India economic and trade relations can, of course, grow incrementally, but some like green shoots, as you mentioned, of course, the green economy and focus on that. But would you have some thoughts, some radical thoughts? May I invite radical thoughts, sir? We are in the business of, promoting ideas. So, if not radical, the word radical may sound radical, but what we mean is brainstorming. Because you see, what we discuss here is a public debate, a discussion. We are in the business of ideas, and of course, linking those ideas to people, and the more people get interested in those, the more the karma moves. So would you have some any 2 3 pet ideas of yours? And Dr. Krishna, I'll come to you with that question also. So just FYI, prep up. So would you have some perspectives, because that's what shapes the future, sir.
No, look, we've just gone through the COVID year,
Hanji.
and there is an old saying amongst economists and amongst policymakers, never waste a crisis. Now, it turns out that in terms of economic reform policies, not the business cycle policies of fiscal deficits and monetary policies, etc., which the entire world joined in on last year, but on structural change policies, it turns out that any ranking of, and I've done some research on that, that India is by far exceeded any other country in terms of structural change policies. There was, there's Brazil in that list, there's Indonesia in that list, there's Greece in that list. But what India has been able to do over the last year is really bring about long-standing, long-needed structural change. That is, so from India's side, I think the government has done practically, there's one area remains, which is the form of direct taxation, which the finance minister started in 2019 by the reduction in corporate taxes. But outside of that, outside the direct taxes realm, we know that indirect taxes are being reformed, and now labor laws, farm laws, bankruptcy laws, GST. So the amount of structural change that has happened in India over the last 3-4 years is really phenomenal, and more than all the economic reforms put together in India previously. So this is a cusp. This is a turning point, and has ramifications for not only the US policies towards India, but the development of India. So I think we are in for, India is in for really exciting times over the next few years. And there's, clearly, and I think Dr. Krishna referred to it in terms of international taxation, retrospective taxation. We have, it's not as if all our problems are solved. We have those problems to solve, and I'm hopeful that they will be solved over the next few years, such that, basically India is a place, we have a large population, and we also want to, we have reached the aspiration stage. Most of the population is now lower middle class to middle class. Aspirations are high, and I think the government is very, very conducive, or the policies are very conducive towards uplifting. So I think investment in India is going to be very, very rewarding. That's what I said in the beginning. This is India's decade. I will warn that I said so in 2001, I said so in 2011. It didn't quite turn out India's decade. I wasn't that far off. I was definitely off. This time, I don't think I'm off. 2021, 2031 will be remembered, including the year of the COVID, as as India's decade. So I think very exciting times.
Thank you so much, sir. The message I'm taking from your talk is that I asked you for your big picture idea about, if radical brainstorming about the opportunity for India or with respect to India and America. The message I'm getting from you is actually very powerful. What you're saying is that the core message is the organic growth of India, or the organic, evolution of India. That in itself is the big, if not game changer, but the big vector in what this decade will play out, right, sir? I mean, that's the big picture I'm getting, that the where India is right now, and organically, given the various aspects that you've highlighted, that that itself is the big idea, perhaps. And oftentimes in life, what happens, true, we miss out because we are so much in the routine of things, that what the normal is itself, or is itself the story. Thank you so much, sir. And if I may add as a footnote before I move to Dr. Krishna, you said that economists don't want to waste a crisis. Sir, with your due permission, we have launched what is known as the Lemonade Party globally. Life hands you a lemon, make lemonade. I've okay, within US Impact and Imagine India as a general percent, it's a global motivational movement. The idea is that, okay, about 30 years ago, green environment was a big issue, and many folks came up, and the Green Party, what the world needs today. And actually, I'll hark back to what you and Dr. Krishna were saying, the healing of America or healing of the world or anywhere, the healing, etc., and never waste a crisis. So, as of a month ago, we launched quote unquote a notional cloud based the Lemonade Party. So, we'll be more than happy to have you over a Zoom conversation, anyone with a glass of lemonade, and talk about never wasting a crisis. Dale Carnegie or whatever. If life gives us lemons, let's try and make the best of it. Thank you so much, sir, because that kind of dovetailed into something. Thank you. Now, may I come to Dr. Krishna with the same question as and before, of course, guys, folks, this is Facebook Live going on. We are just coming to the last round about the role of Indian American community. And before that, folks, you're listening. This is live Facebook Live on the US India Political Action Committee page and Imagine India page. Please keep your questions coming. Your likes are good, but what helps us is interaction. As you can see, we have brilliant minds giving their insights. Thank you. Now, Dr. Krishna, coming back to the same thing. Any brainstorming ideas on US India trade economy? How could be, would be your pet thought? What is your pet peeve? What is not happening between US India trade and economy? For example, why not? Sir.
Look, let me say this. I want to point out, and this is a point that sometimes get lost in the discussion about trade agreements and so forth. And that is that we actually, India, we don't need a special trade deal with the United States or a special trade deal with China. We don't necessarily need that. If you look at how China grew, let's say from the year 1990 till 2020, right? China had no special trade deals with anybody. There's no special trade deal with the United States, right? So they got some marginal agreements here and there. But the point that I'd like to make now, and maybe this sounds odd coming from an international trade economist, but our focus should be, and has been rightly, should be more substantially on our own competitiveness, on our own productivity, on our own ability to do things better within the country, right? So after that, if you got a trade deal that lowered the tariff in the U.S. by another 5%, or you got some better access, by all means, let's pursue these, kind of market access improvements, and let's go with that. But the primary challenge remains the Indian domestic situation in terms of competitiveness, productivity. Now, on that, I agree again, and I find myself in 100% agreement with Dr. Bhala throughout the session, I think. But I agree that a lot has actually been done in the last 5 or 6 years. There's been a gradual path starting in the 1990s. Many important things were done, but a number of dramatic things, which I did not think I would see be taken up by the government, have in fact been taken up by the government. The GST reform, the labor market reforms, varieties of things. The FDI policy, dramatic changes, right? So some of these things are going to take time to play out, and we'll see, and hopefully I think we will. I'm fairly confident that we will reap the rewards of these improvements, structural improvements in the economy. They're going to serve us very well. Whether this is going to happen in the next 3 years or 5 years or 10, I think we're in for an exciting ride. And I remain hopeful that with the economic framework that we have in place and the structural changes that are underway, that we can support a kind of a good, strong trajectory towards higher growth. So sorry, I don't have super radical ideas to offer, other than that we maybe shouldn't worry so much about the lack of our trade agreements. Let's make do with the trading relations that we already have.
Actually, that's a very interesting point you make. So, and without being political, we all are living in a political context and all. And the message or the progress of India about quote unquote of our network, right? I mean, I'm moderate. I'm not fair enough. We all are. I mean, we all are. Moderate. We all are. I mean, so I'm not, talking about this in terms of, like pure, appreciation without a context. But what you're saying is, and what Dr. Bhalla is saying is that absolutely Atmanirbhar in that sense of self-reliance, which can be seen in different ways, but even it's not self-reliance, it's about self-empowerment, maybe, self. I mean, as you said that the trade agreements, fine, we can see and all, which will happen. Thank you so much, Dr. Krishna. Now we come to the last round, which is, and once again, folks, it's my duty as a moderator to keep on calling. Folks, whosoever is watching, please come on. This is the last round. We have such brilliant people. Your questions will help me think and will help our eminent panel think, and bring them some interesting perspectives on the question of the day. So while we wait for that, we have a viewer saying super points, Dr. Bhalla. Thank you so much, Kanan. Also saying super point, Dr. Krishna. Thank you so much, Kanan. Kanan is following. It seems we have sometimes it happens. Several folks who follow. See, if it's a 1 hour Facebook discussion, people come watch 5 minutes, 10 minutes, go watch, go watch. But there are a lot of folks who stay on. And by the way, folks who whoever is listening, also this would be on YouTube, stored on our YouTube channel, and it will be shared with you later on. Now, Dr. Bala, last round, please. And of course, sir, I'll take you on this point of economists never waste a crisis, because I want to talk about Lemonade Party, but that's separate. Uh, uh, the Indian American community, the US India Political Action Committee, we've been doing some things. Imagine India Institute, we've been doing some things over the years, engaging, and the Indian American community, of course, is doing a lot and is there everywhere. And sure, their opinion counts, their thoughts count, they participate in the public process as good citizens, positive thoughts. Would you have any thoughts on how the Indian American community on the first time, because you see within domestic American economy, what the Biden administration does affects everyone. It's not Indian American, it's Irish Americans, American, American, American. What could what could be good for America for its own economy? One question. And second, a footnote, little footnote. Any aspects on U.S. India relations? So, firstly, what is good for America within America, and secondly, what could be the Indian American community can play a role, highlight some thoughts, champion some ideas, champion some brainstorming on US India relations on trade and economy, sir.
Well, um, look, the Indian community in the US is has become relatively large in terms of its impact. They are in various influential positions, and we both India and the US share the great bond that comes out from democracy, from being open. So there is a natural and the language. Let us not underestimate the impact that language has. The Indians that come over here have speak as good English as the natives, and that forms and the values. I think they're very similar. I first came to the U.S. A long time ago, and what I noticed then was that we are similar in more ways than one can document. And I think that's part of the great uh, bond that Indian and Americans have, and so it's a very natural for Indians to be and take part. We are just as political. That's another big factor. Indians are born politicians or take an interest in politics. Same thing in the U.S. the language is there, democracy is there. So, and a belief now in India, starting in 1990, and then accelerating over the last 5, 7 years of belief in markets. Um, so, we're similar people. The only difference is that we might be more argumentative than the Americans, but not much more argumentative. So, we share a bond, and there are Indians who've come here starting. It used to be that if you were looking at the world from Mars, the Indians in England who got trained in England between 1900 and 1960 would be very influential. Now you have Indians who came to the US, very influential, and they're also very influential in England. So it comes from having a large population, I guess. But I think underlying it all is a shared value system.
Thank you, sir. That's so beautifully said. Yeah, sure. I mean, the argumentative Indian, sure. Loud Indian. But yes, shared values and yes, an interesting point which you mentioned with respect to England and America. Yeah, probably the 1940s to 60s. It would be people would go for law or barristers and all studies in the UK and come back, etc. And later on, it became technology folks in the US and shared values. But you made a very clear point that it's about the market also, right? And innovation and linking of those two. So thank you so much, sir. I think that's what's kind of happening. So more of that to happen. And now let's move on to Dr. Krishna, who himself is an exemplar of this one such, who would be, could be. So, Dr. Krishna, what would you think that uh, between the US and India, the Indian American community is doing, could be doing, may not be doing, but what are your thoughts on that? Once again, blue sky thinking, sir.
No, no, you look, the Indian American community has done fabulously well. Whatever space you look at, whether it's sort of business, academia, doctors, engineers, the heads of all these various, the CEOs of Google and Microsoft and whatever else, they've done tremendously well. And so this is true of this is true of the community very broadly, and without even necessarily focusing on the people who've kind of achieved super success in the system. There's just a broad level of success and, in a sense, assimilation as well. A no problem community, a model community that Indian Americans are seen as. So I think all of these are very, very clear, good indications of kind of Indian success or Indian American success, and the ways in which they're seen and perceived here. So there isn't too much to add there. The one thing I'll note is that increasingly I see that Indians who are maybe second generation, possibly third generation, right? So they've moved away from maybe traditional jobs like an immigrant. You come to the country, you're gonna get a degree, maybe you get a job, and you're gonna make most of that. And then your children are able to do a little bit more, and their children are able to integrate a bit more. And so you're seeing slowly greater political participation by the Indian American community. You're seeing deeper roots. And you're seeing in spaces where it was unusual to see, like in the White House, various governmental appointments in Washington. It was quite unusual until relatively recently to see these sorts of appointments, and you're seeing them now with a very high frequency already. Just the change between 4 years ago and now is very substantial, and I'm very, very hopeful that this is all going well. So as far as any thoughts or advice on what to do, I don't have any. I think everything has been going great. And as far as relations between the countries, I think it's a lot of people-to-people contact, and this is how it works. And the impression that people have of India and the incentives they have to kind of make those connections and come to India, whatever, if it is Americans, all of that is being, all of that looks good to me. It's all on a very positive trend.
So thank you so much, Dr. Krishna, for your thoughts. Absolutely. I mean, the spectrum is so wide and so much really is happening. But yeah, sure. In fact, the point I do agree and understand what Dr. Bhalla is saying, you're saying is that all the vibrance, and which again it comes down to it's organic in a way. I think the takeaway for me is that things are organic, and life takes its own form. We need not necessarily, but at the same time, I was trying to push the envelope and try to tease out some ideas from you, our distinguished panel, about some ideas on what's there. But the key, in fact, the big picture takeaway for me would be, and for our audiences would be, perhaps it's organic. A lot is happening out there. Now, that said, we move to the last round, closing, last comments. Before we do that, folks, come on. This is Facebook Live. We've been having a brilliant discussion. Whosoever is watching, we have several people watching. Come on, guys, put in your comments and all. We'll take it. And of course, this video will be stored on YouTube and shared. But that said, may I now come to Dr. Surjit Bhalla. Sir, we've been talking, meandering all around. In your wisdom, the topic of the day was Trump versus Biden trade policies. Let's keep that aside. President Biden is the president today, right? In the next 4 years, I don't know the number of US India trade right now, bilateral, some number, or you were talking about decade, 20, the decade of this decade you were talking, you look at longer numbers, right? What is your take, the big picture, or any which way, it's your floor to give your closing comments, sir. On okay, now the closing comment would be on US India economic and trade relations. Sir.
No, look, as we've discussed, growth is going to be good for India. Trade is going to expand. There are some interesting targets that the government has put out on trade, including trade with the US. So it's what we need. If we are discussing trade, what we need to understand and appreciate is that in the last decade, world trade did not grow. Maybe grew by a couple of percentage points over from 2011 when it peaked to now. So I think this is part of the spreading out process of globalization, of domestic production for domestic consumption being greater. The world price level hasn't moved. So there are lots of fundamental changes happening in the world for all countries, and they'll continue. Because of the reforms that India has had, we will stand to do better than most, if not all, countries. And US India trade, business, etc., can only increase in importance. And I expect it will because of the geopolitical and other considerations we've talked about.
Sure, sir. May I not put you on a spot? I cannot ever, but if I may dare to or ask you, let's say the bottom line is the quality of life, right? Before I come to Dr. Krishna. So let's say the per capita GDP of India today, I don't know what the number is, or we know, or what do you anticipate? Keep aside America, whatever. What do you anticipate the per capita GDP in per capita in India in the year 25 or 30? You can take any call. You're welcome, sir.
You take whatever, whichever measure per capita GDP you have
Mhm.
today for India in PPP dollars and US dollars, whatever, and you give it a growth rate of about 5 to 6 to 7%. So take an average of 6% per year. And
Okay.
actually, the other interesting story, but we have to conclude now, but
Yes.
related to that question, is that population growth in India is now only at 1%. So when we're talking a per capita, we need to go at 7% for per capita GDP to go at 6%. which for a long time it was almost impossible. So there are several things going on, but take a number between 5 and 7 as an average for the next 5 years growth rate.
Thank you so much, sir. And we will make lemonade with the lemons that we have. Sure, because thank you so much, sir. And once again, folks, I mean, we are on the concluding round, and we will take your question, but we will not get them our panel to answer because we are right now out of time. So, Dr. Krishna, your concluding thoughts
Yeah,
on you
yeah.
may take it as skin, or you may, take it from any prism, all yours, sir.
Well, let me just say very quickly that the one thing I would add is that the support for India in Washington and support for India in the U.S. more broadly, in my view, it appears to be broadly bipartisan, right? So, and this is a very good thing. It was seen most clearly, the bipartisan level of support was seen most clearly during the US India civil nuclear deal negotiations. There was actually a surprising level, and I think US and PAC actually played a role at that time in kind of evolving this bipartisan support in favor of India as well. And I just hope, and you asked a question earlier about what US and PAC could do as well, that as we evolve as time goes on, that we continue to maintain continue to have this, right? It's actually very useful to have bipartisan support in the U.S., and I hope we don't become, that doesn't change, that we're seen exclusively as a friend of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or something else. I don't see any great danger of that happening anytime soon, but that's one thing that struck me as being valuable that we didn't comment on yet in the U.S.-India relationship, and I hope that that continues.
Oh, that's very interestingly said, sir. And by the way, you mentioned the US and a nuclear deal. Only yesterday, I think, Dr. Sanjay Babu, he wrote a column in, I think, the Hindu Business Line or whatever, about the diaspora dialogue, something, something, in which he devoted himself 2 paragraphs about US impact. So yesterday morning, I read that and I was so surprised. It was such a, I mean, it's fun to read, someone who's talking about you, the work you've done, etc., etc. So that was a brilliant, that was happiness, one. And secondly, yes, the US India Political Action Committee, to the extent that we are at we are not partisan, bipartisan. We are a platform. We got to live and let live. We got to work with everyone. Our agenda is, we don't have any fixed. Not, I mean, it would be wrong to say that we don't have fixed ideologies, but our ideology is, I think, broadly. Come on, guys, let's move on. I mean, it's if there's a crisis, never waste a crisis, as Dr. Bhalla said. Life gives you a lemon, make lemonade. That's our philosophy. Live and let live, keep on. We got to work with anyone, any administration, one way or the other in the US or in India. Happy. Let's work to an agenda. Let's come down to some consensus and let's keep moving towards it. Because there can be too much politics, there can be too many things. But why waste our energies? We have limited time on this earth, all of us. Now, thank you so much, our eminent distinguished panel, for this brilliant time. And I hope our folks who've been listening, who've been commenting, please keep your questions coming. This video would be put up on our US India Political Action Committee YouTube page, as well as Imagine India YouTube page. And we'll be more than happy to take any questions. And we will once again look forward. And thank you so much, Dr. Bhalla. It may be quite late tonight, your time, sir. Thank you so much for your indulgence. Thank you so much, Dr. Krishna, for your time. It's been a pleasure. Again, Kanan, it seems Kanan in Virginia has been listening. He says, excellent panel. Thank you, Kanan. That's what gives us the energy. What we do, if we can, kind of get engaged. See, a live show has its own nuances. So thank you so much, our esteemed panel, and we look forward to our next show. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
And I would like to thank our colleagues at the US India Political Action Committee, Prasoon and Santino, who helped us put this whole show together. Thank you so much, folks, and other folks who make this happen every Saturday noon. Thank you. The show ends now.